C++ was made in 1983 by this lovely man. His name was Bjarne Stroustrup. And it's still one of the most widely used programming languages today. It was made for high efficiency, low-level systems programming, like close to the hardware, building operating systems and device drivers and these kinds of things. It was built on top of a previous language called C. And they added new features to C. And otherwise, a lot of the syntax is retained from that older language. The reason they call it C++, I mean, you guys probably know ++ from Java. What does it do? This is like the next increment above C. It's like one more than C, right? That's the joke here. Even though it's an old language, they're still working on it and adding new features to this day. They made a new version last year, 2014, with new features. So it's not a dead language at all. It's pretty similar to Java. So if I don't show something or if I skip over something, it's probably because you just write whatever you would have written if you wrote it in Java. Like you use curly braces to start and stop things. And you use the same kind of operators, plus, minus, times, divide, mod. Those are there. A lot of the data types are the same, int and double for numbers. You'll see a lot of things that are familiar. I'm going to focus more on the differences. Now, one thing about C++ here at Stanford is we're going to use some special add-ons and libraries that were built here at this university. But I'll talk about those in a minute. Here is a C++ program. Here it is, our first program. You know this tradition, right? You're supposed to write a program that prints hello world. That's supposed to be your first program you ever see in a language. So that's how to do that in C++. So what are all these things? Well, wait, don't I have a, no? OK, let's talk about this program for a second. These first two parts that say include and using, those are like import statements in Java. Those mean I'm going to use libraries from the system. I'm writing both of those lines to indicate that I want to use the console for output. Main is the set of commands, the set of statements that your program executes. There's a main in Java. So if you came from Java, that should be familiar. In Java, you say public, stat, you have a bunch of stuff up here. In C, it's shorter. One thing you'll find in C and C++ is usually the lines of code are a little narrower. You don't have to type quite as many characters a lot of the time. You say int main. If you want to print things in C++, you say console out, arrow, arrow, hello world, arrow, arrow, endl. Endl means end line. Go to the next line. So that's just printing output to the console to say hello world. Return 0. You guys hopefully have learned about return. That's when a method sends information back to whatever it was called from. In Java, the main method is called a void method. It doesn't have to do that. But in C++, the main method returns an integer indicating some sort of status about how the program finished running. And so we always return 0. So it's a little bit annoying. You have to write return 0 at the end of all your programs. But that's a program that prints hello world. If I go to the Qt creator, I've got that program right here. And if I compile it, so this is the Qt creator editor. It's meant to be pretty simple. There's just a button right here that says run. And I'll talk more about this editor. I mean, I didn't show you how to set up the project or whatever. I'll come to that. I don't have very much time left. But if you click run, it will compile the program if necessary. You guys remember you have to compile it into binary first before you can run it, right? So if you click run, it will compile if needed, and then it will execute this thing. And it pops up a console, and it says hello world. So that's my program. So that's our first C++ program there. You'll notice that it's got the green. Those are comments, right? And I didn't mention those. Those are the same syntax that Java uses. So nothing new there. When you write a program, you put it in a .cpp file. That's the file type for C++ programs. There's other types as well that we'll talk about later. When you compile your program, it's actually built into something called an executable. Now, in Java, do you know what file comes out when you compile a Java program? What's the extension at the end of the dot for those files? Do you know what I'm talking about? Yes? Jar? OK, well, jar is actually a sort of a packaged version of a whole Java application. What about individual .java files? What do they turn into before you get a .jar? Do you know? What's a compiled Java file turn into? exe, good choice. That's on Windows only, though. There's an intermediate. Do you know? .class, yeah. .class is like a compiled version of a Java program. That's right. So one thing that's different between C++ and Java, in Java, when you compile a program, that compiled version can now be executed on any kind of computer. You could run it on a Windows or a Mac or Linux or anything you want, a toaster or whatever. In C++, when you compile your program, you actually get an executable program that only runs on that operating system. So like if I compile, I use Linux, because that's how I roll. And do you know why I use Linux? Because I can set the screen on fire. Whoosh. Yeah. OK, anyway. It has other advantages, too. But if I compile my program, the output, the compiled version of it, will only run on Linux. And if I give it to you and you run a Mac, it won't run. So actually, that makes things a little bit trickier. Anyway, C++ is older, so that's one difference. So you have a main. You put statements inside with semicolons. One difference you'll notice about the syntax is in Java, you always have what's called a public class around your main. And that's a big difference between Java and C++. Java is what's called very object-oriented. So everything's part of a class, and objects are a class. And we'll talk about that later. But C++, it's not always that way. You can just write functions that just sit there all by themselves. They're called freestanding functions, free functions. So the main is not inside of some public class. You just say main, and you just start typing. And that's your program. Yeah, so a little bit different syntax there. There's a whole bunch of syntax that's the same, though. Look at all this. This works in Java and C++. It's all pretty much the same. There's only one tiny difference on this slide between the equivalent Java. Can anybody spot the part that's different from Java? It's very subtle. Bool? Yeah, that fourth line, it says bool b equals true. Do you remember this data type in Java called Boolean? B-O-O-L-E-A-N? That's for logic, true, false, yes, no, that kind of stuff. In Java, you write Boolean, and in C++, you just write bool. C++ loves cutting letters off of things to save you typing. So other than that, all of this would have been valid Java code as well.